This is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas R. Verney. My guest today is Jeffrey Mishlove PhD, a clinical psychologist, host of the podcast New Thinking Aloud, author of an encyclopedic volume of consciousness studies called The Roots of Consciousness. Dr. Mishlove is a scientist known worldwide for his serious research on unexplained phenomena. He is past director of the Association for Humanistic Psychology, excuse me, and has served as president of the Intuition Network. Jeffrey holds the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology to be awarded by an accredited American university, University of California at Berkeley. His avocations include financial forecasting. I've never heard that before, so we hope we can talk about that. Hiking in the Mojave Desert and karaoke. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate you on being recently awarded the Bigelow Institute Competition Grand Prize for your paper, Beyond the Brain: The Survival of Human Consciousness After Permanent Bodily Death. So I understand that you were studying criminology when at age 27, a dream about your Uncle Harry made you study parapsychology. Can you tell me a bit about the content of that dream for those of us who have not read your paper?
You know, it's very difficult, Thomas, to put the content into words because it
Yes.
was a soul-to-soul communication, and there's nothing that I could tell you that would adequately communicate how powerful it was. But I can say that when I woke up from this dream visitation, I was just sobbing. I was crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing one of the most sacred songs in the Jewish tradition, song reserved just for the high holidays, Avinu Malkeinu. And it was, beyond any question, the most powerful dream experience I've ever had in my life. And at that point, it made me realize that I had to refocus my career aspirations. Instead of being focused on the negative side of human deviance, meaning psychopathology and crime, I decided to shift at that point to the positive side of human deviance, meaning mysticism, creativity, psychic functioning, and intuition.
And so that was quite a shift from criminology into parapsychology.
Yeah, it was, and it was permanent. I can look back now 50 years ago and see that that was a turning point in my life. Otherwise, I would have probably pursued a career in the criminal justice system.
Right, right. Okay, so your paper, the one that you won the prize, the Bigelow Prize for, is essentially, if I understand it correctly, an attempt to provide scientific proof that human consciousness survives death. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. So you argue that consciousness of any kind occurs because the universe is alive and mind-like. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we assume that the universe is not, the materialistic assumption is that the universe is composed of
Atoms,
dead
protons.
particles.
Yeah.
And that generates what is known in philosophy as the hard problem of consciousness. How do you get living, viable consciousness out of dead particles? No one has yet even come up with a conceivable way that could occur. It's been a thorn in the side of neuroscientists and philosophers for I don't know how long, but probably safe to say centuries.
So I would like to understand mind like since we don't know what the mind is, how do you define mind like?
Well, I think it was Thomas Nagel, a philosopher, who wrote a wonderful book about what is it like to be a bat. And
Okay.
basically, he's saying that to be conscious means that it's something, it's like something to be you. In order for you to be conscious, in other words, it's having experience. A bat has experience. I think we could agree.
Yes. Yes. Well, you also quote, well, you also quote William James' theory that the brain is the filter of consciousness instead of its source. Um, could you explain what you mean by filter?
Uh, Very good question. William James gave this lecture. I think it's the Gifford Lecture. He delivered
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
England and
Yeah.
Oxford, Cambridge in 1894. And he's again addressing the question of life after death. And he proposes the conventional neurological theory is that the brain generates consciousness. But William James suggested, what if the brain is a receiver
Hmm.
rather than a generator of consciousness, maybe like a radio receiver? And furthermore, a filter, because already in his era, there were reports of cosmic consciousness, people who said they had 360-degree vision. They could be aware of everything all at once. Well, you can't really support a family and have a career that way. It's hard to sustain normal human life unless you filter down consciousness to those things that are relevant for survival. And so that's what he meant by a filter, that of the millions of inputs that we might have just through our senses alone, not to mention our interior perceptions, uh, we would be overwhelmed if we were aware of everything all at once. So consciousness or the brain really serves as a reduction valve of, of sorts. And people who have uh, dysfunction of the brain, for example, in a near-death experience,
Hmm.
often report, this wider cosmic consciousness or mystical visions.
Yes. Yes. Um, well, in your book, sorry, in your paper, you write about the nine arrows, postmortem survival of human consciousness, and you sort of depict it. There's a lovely diagram there of sort of the 9 different ways in which you support uh, the idea that consciousness survives death, right?
That's correct. It,
Uh, and which of those 9 that you mentioned there do you think is the strongest proof? Which is
well,
the one?
that's a
Yeah,
good question
thank you.
because there are adherents to each of them who would say
Uh-huh.
this is the strongest proof. But I suppose if I had to choose the single best line of evidence, it would
Yes.
be what we call mental mediumship.
Uh-huh.
People who have mediumistic gifts and can communicate with the afterlife, and uh, they come through with incredible detail, evidence about deceased people, and not just evidence, but skill, chess playing skill, for example, or personality comes through these mediums in ways that is totally authentic and convincing to the people who should know best, such as deceased relatives. There, one such medium I wrote about in Britain came was the how do you put it, the mediumistic host of a deceased medical doctor who came through him and performed healings for a period of some 60 years consistently. And when members of his family, William Lang was the name of the deceased doctor, his family members learned about this and they thought, this can't be real. Our father is not coming through some medium in a little town west of London. So they went to visit with the thought that they would debunk this purported medium, but instead became convinced. And William Lang's daughter, Lyndon Lang, actually died not long ago and bequeathed a great bulk of her estate to the medium, George Chapman, because she believed in his mediumship. And she introduced him to many of William Lang's colleagues who had sessions with George Chapman, seances, you could say, for decades. They were convinced of his reality in the afterlife, coming through this medium. People who had known him and were not inclined to be spiritualistic believers at all.
Yes. Well, I can certainly identify with that. I went actually to, I guess, a spiritualist or a medium because so many of my patients had seen her, and she would tell them things that nobody could possibly guess. I remember one of my patients was told that her father was dragging his right leg behind him. And it's true, her father had some kind of a war injury, and his right leg, he always, dragged behind him. So I went to see her just to see, what she would tell me. And amongst other things, she started telling me about my wife's mother and how she appreciated the fact that she put her ashes into the Detroit River. And I said, no. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I think she put it into the Windsor River or something like that. And she said, well, I don't know. I see Detroit River here. I came home, told my wife, she said, Detroit River. And I didn't know that. Like, this medium knew something, because very often people will say, well, somehow, they read your mind or something like that, right? Not so. Not so. And the other, I like of your 9 arrows, what sort of I find most convincing is the near-death experiences after cardiac arrest. Again, I had one experience as an intern at St. Michael's Hospital, where I was interning a long time ago, and one of my patients right in front of me died. For all intents and purposes, he had a cardiac arrest. And I was taught that you take a syringe with adrenaline and you just put it into his chest, right where the heart is, just hope that you hit it. And I did. And then I called in, much more senior people than myself. Everybody came around. After about 5 to 10 minutes, the patient came back, so to speak. And then he described everything that happened in the room, but from the point of view of about 5 feet above him, looking down. Things that he could not possibly have experienced just by listening, for example. So I am very much, on your side on this, but also being sort of scientifically minded, I'm wondering, going back, for example, to the filter, physiologically speaking, like, how does this filter work? Which cells in the brain are doing the filtering?
What a good question. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't have
Hmm.
these details. And to my knowledge, the whole field of neuroscience has a long way to go.
Yes.
But I am very fond of the philosophical work of Bernardo Kastrup, who is also a computer scientist and a philosopher,
Yeah.
and probably the strongest contemporary philosopher arguing in favor of what is known as metaphysical idealism. That basically the point you were discussing
Yeah.
earlier, that the whole universe is mind-like rather than physical. And so one could say that it's not so much that the mind exists inside the brain, but that the brain exists inside the mind, and that somehow being humans as we are, and with this sense of separation, you and I are, we have different histories, we live inside different skin. Uh, but this membrane is not the whole story. It's only valid at one level of our being. At another level, the membranes open up, and we have access to ultimately each other's consciousness, as the medium was able to reach out to your deceased mother-in-law, for example.
Hmm.
It's an example that would be an illustration of how vast human consciousness can be.
Well, okay, so that brings me to a different point then. Um, one of the stories, anecdotes that you describe is your co-producer, Emmy Vadney. Do I pronounce that correctly?
Madness, yes.
Yes, Vadney.
Emily,
Yes,
who's interviewed you
yes,
twice, I believe.
twice. Yes, yes. A lovely, 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 charming lady, and very knowledgeable. So she describes how what was it? Her father-in-law came to her in a dream.
This was okay. It was her mother-in-law
Yeah,
had, had died. She was very close to her mother-in-law,
right,
and the body was lying in state in their own home.
right, right,
And then they took the body to the crematorium
right.
at 3 in the morning. While the body is in the crematorium, Emmy's stepfather, who was
Stepfather,
obviously
right.
close to the family,
Yes, Donald
received,
Empson. Yes.
yes, he received a text message that came from Emmy's phone, which said, "Glad it's over." And then he checked with Emmy the next day. "You sent me this message at 3 in the morning." And she said, "No, I didn't send you such a message. And I wouldn't send you such a message. I loved my uh, mother-in-law, and I'm not glad it's over. But she might be glad it's over because," and Emmy then showed her own phone that no text message had been sent at all.
Right.
So
I understand that. But why would her stepfather, of all the people in the world, send her a message?
well, you mean received the message.
Okay, receive the
He
message. Right,
received the message
right.
apparently from her mother-in-law.
From her mother-in-law. Right.
They both have come to see it that way, and he was a total skeptic of
Hmm.
this sort of thing.
Hmm.
And I don't have the answer why him. And
Hmm.
I mean, that's like, I ask myself this question sometimes: why am I me
Hmm.
instead of you?
Hmm. Hmm.
I, some things we just don't know, but it is clearly a paranormal event that he
Yes.
received a message from her phone, but her phone didn't send a message.
Hmm.
And it's consistent with a whole body of literature, which is one of the 9 arrows in my essay, known
Yes.
as instrumental transcommunication,
Right.
where we have today tens of thousands of hobbyists who are communicating with their deceased loved ones using computers and telephones and uh, televisions and other forms of electronic media.
Well, what I have observed over my lifetime is that, for example, twins or people who are very closely related, who are very much along, I don't know, the same sympathetic communication network, so to speak, who somehow are emotionally, meaningfully connected,
Yeah.
will often be able to get feelings, overpowering feelings, such as, oh my God, something is happening to my twin. And then you find out 2 or 3 hours later that your twin was involved in a car accident or had a cardiac arrest or anything like that, right?
Right.
But and that makes, that makes a lot of sense. But why, someone, like a mother-in-law uh, would would send a message to a stepfather, it just doesn't quite make sense.
Well, it also was through Emmy's phone. Emmy's phone
Yeah,
was
right.
involved
Yeah.
somehow, and she was very close to the mother-in-law.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So there, that was probably the stronger emotional
Mm.
connection.
And
Uh,
were you close to your Uncle Harry?
Not particularly. I hadn't seen him for many years. He was
Mm-hmm.
50 years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
I did learn that a number of his grandchildren also had communications from him
Oh,
around the time of his death. I wasn't the only one,
uh-huh.
but maybe I was the most receptive for some reason.
Yes, yes. I think that makes a lot of sense. And you talk actually about the wording. It makes a lot of sense in your paper, because it implies that we sort of trust our senses instead of our intuition. So apologies for using that expression. But anyway, that makes a lot of sense. But uh, you know, coming being a chess player, I was very interested in your example about Geza Marozzi
Yes,
and the chess player. Actually, there is still an expression in chess, which is the Marozzi bind. I don't know whether you're familiar with it or not. No. Yeah, the Marozzi bind is C4 and E4. And it's still very much used in chess circles. But anyway, what you describe is that he played against Korchnoi,
yes.
and then you say that it went on for 36 years.
No, no, 7 years,
Oh, 7 years. Okay.
as I recall.
Oh, okay, 7 years. And then Bobby Fischer, Grandmaster himself, one of the greatest players in chess history, although he kind of became crazy later on, examined the moves and he appraised Marozzi's game at the Grandmaster level, correct?
Correct.
So that again is really quite convincing. Now let's talk about Stevenson.
But before we do
Yeah,
that, Thomas, we should probably make sure your viewers understand
yes,
Maroczy had died in 1951, and
yes,
he was communicating the chess moves through a medium, through
yes,
automatic writing.
yes,
And he also answered nearly 100 questions about his personal life with 98% accuracy, and including answers that the researchers originally thought were false, but then through further research, they learned they were true, just like your example of the Detroit River.
right, 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 right. Well, uh, thank you for pointing that out. Um, I am familiar with even Stevenson's methodology, professor at the University of Virginia, and he has collected a database of over 2,500 individual cases in which young children report former life memories. Correct?
Well, Stevenson himself died a few years ago, and
Yes.
research has continued since
Mhm.
his death. And I believe the number is currently 2,700 cases of young children who remember previous lives and start talking about them almost as soon as they can speak.
So did if my memory serves me, did not most of his cases sort of originate in India?
Yes, most of them were in India and Burma and in countries where people believe in reincarnation. That's true.
Right, right. So very few cases in North America.
Well, there are probably at this point dozens,
Hmm.
but relative to the entire database, fewer.
Hmm. So
That's correct.
how do you explain that?
Well, there certainly are cultural factors
Hmm.
involved. People in countries where reincarnation is an accepted belief are more likely to report these cases, more likely to investigate them. Uh, Whereas in Western countries, there's, I, I think, a tendency, just to dismiss the evidence
Hmm.
and not bring it to the attention of researchers.
Yeah, it's very true. You state in your paper that usually you can get these reports from very young children up to the age of 5, and then they kind of gradually disappear.
And yes, and by the time they are teenagers, the memories fade almost completely.
Hmm. Well, that's very interesting because, as you probably know, I have done a lot of work on prenatal memories, early memories of children, right?
Yes.
And I have found that there are many reports in the literature and also through personal contacts where children between the ages of 2 and 5, when you ask them when they are in a very relaxed state, particularly when they're taking a bath, and you ask them, what do you remember about your birth? They will come out with these incredible, accurate stories of what happened to them. And sometimes they'll go back even before birth.
Yes.
But by the time they are 4 or 5, it recedes and it stops,
Yeah.
more or less. And there are a few people, a few adults, just like you state in terms of these past memories, who still remember what happened to them at birth and sometimes even pre-birth. But
Yes.
usually you can get there with some people through hypnosis, with other people through LSD, psilocybin, psychotherapy sometimes. And I guess the same thing applies to past memories somehow.
An
Correct?
interesting
Yeah.
feature of the past memory database
Yeah.
is that a very high percentage of the previous lives were ones that ended violently.
Yes. Yes. You mentioned that. Yes. And
So that
yeah.
may be the violent death, may be a factor in the
Mm,
children having a stronger memory. And
yes.
furthermore, many of these children are born with deformities and birthmarks
Mm-hmm.
that correspond to the death wounds of the
Mm-hmm.
previous person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And the other thing that you said a few minutes ago, when we were talking about Uncle Harry and why you sort of received the message, if you like, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term. Uh, I've also found that when I was investigating heart transplants, that the same kind of a thing applied. That there's some people who are open to somehow be able to incorporate, absorb what the other person's personality was, and others are not.
Uh-huh.
And then there's also the cultural factor that in our society, it's really not good form to talk about having changed personalities as a result of
Mhm.
heart transplants, right? And
Right.
and the few doctors that I have spoken to who do heart transplants, when I ask them whether they ever talk to their patients about changes in personality, looked at me as if I was crazy.
Oh, what a shame.
Yes, 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 yes. So again, there are, and I'm sure that in your work you have run up against this kind of this kind of barrier to accepting anything that was not taught to these doctors in school.
It's very unfortunate that in our culture, uh, there's a dominant philosophy. Some people call it naturalism, that which is anything that suggests the supernatural, automatically we can ignore
Right,
because it cannot possibly be true.
right,
Uh, it's a very destructive attitude because it means that people who hold that attitude become unaware of their own potential.
right. Exactly, exactly. Yes. So coming back to you then, what do you think in your own background contributed to your interest in this subject?
That's a very good question. And I don't know. I think I had a very conventional background. My
Yeah,
father ran a furniture store.
yeah.
But let me say a few things about my Uncle Harry.
Yes, okay.
After he died, I asked my relatives, could I have an object that belonged to him to remember him by? And they sent me a book. And they said this was Uncle Harry's favorite book.
Mm-hmm,
It took me a while to figure out what it was because it was written in Yiddish.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and but when I finally had it translated, I understood this is a book called The Tales of the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of the Hasidic school of Jewish mysticism. And I didn't realize, unbeknownst to me,
Mm-hmm.
my great uncle Harry was a mystic at heart.
And how did he know that you would welcome that kind of a book and that kind of mysticism? How did he know that? Did you and he ever talk about it?
No, no, we never discussed it. But at that point in my life, I had, as an undergraduate before, several years earlier,
Mm-hmm.
about 3 years before his death, unbeknownst to him, I actually was studying mysticism. I wrote a senior honors thesis
Oh,
at the University of Wisconsin
uh-huh.
as an undergraduate on the psychology of religious mysticism. And I went into the study thinking that I would write about all the different forms of psychopathology that cause people to have delusions about seeing ghosts and
Mm-hmm.
having mystical experiences. But by the time I had completed all of my investigations, I came to the opposite conclusion that I had encountered the work of Abraham Maslow, who wrote about the peak experience that people had, the most successful people in our culture that he studied, people like Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt and Helen Keller. And they all had what he called peak experiences that were definitive for their whole lives. They were very important to them. And then he went on to say these experiences are indistinguishable from mystical experiences. So I had to reevaluate everything at that point. And so I was very open to that sort of thing.
So what made you go into criminology, which is so far from that?
Well, uh, I studied criminology as an undergraduate, and it seemed like a nice career path. Uh,
Uh-huh.
it didn't seem, you know,
Yeah.
trying to go to a university and saying, I'd like to study mysticism, good luck. It's almost impossible. And I learned that. I struggled over it for many, many months after my dream of Uncle Harry. How can I shift my career? And
Mm-hmm.
this is not in my essay, but an interesting thing happened after months of
Yes.
anguishing because there were no roads to study parapsychology,
No,
creativity,
no.
intuition at the University of California.
Right.
I woke up one morning and I knew that that evening I was going to have a dream, and the dream would give me an answer. And that evening, I had this dream. I dreamt that I was visiting some friends who lived across town. I knocked on the door of their apartment. Nobody was home, but I found a key and let myself in. And in the dream, in the middle of their living room floor, was a magazine. I picked it up. It was called EYE. And as I was paging through the magazine in my dream, I woke up with this feeling of exhilaration, like this is the answer. But I had no idea what it meant. So I acted out the dream. I went to that apartment,
Yes.
put on my tennis shoes, ran 5 miles to
Yes.
get there, knocked on the door. Nobody answered as I had dreamt, and I happened to know where they kept a key. So I let myself in. And there in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine, and it was called Focus. And as I paged through that magazine, I came to the realization, because it was the magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television, KQED, in the San Francisco Bay Area, I could pursue my interests by getting involved in the nonprofit segment of the media. And so, which was a huge shift for me, because at the time I didn't own a radio or a television, and I didn't believe in them. I believed that electronic communications was phony baloney. And I changed my mind at that moment. I went to the local nonprofit station in Berkeley, where I live, called KPFA, a Pacifica radio station, and volunteered. I said I'd be happy to volunteer. And even though I had my master's degree by then, they said to me, okay, sit at this desk, and when you hear the doorbell ring, push this button and let people in the front door. And so I did that, and within 3 weeks, they had given me my own radio show twice a week at noon called The Mind's Ear. And all of a sudden, I found myself sitting across a table from people such as yourself, world-class experts on all the topics that interested me the most. And that gave me the confidence to go back to the university and take advantage of a very obscure rule they had, that if you're already a graduate student in good standing and you want to write a dissertation for your doctoral degree on a topic that no department is willing to sponsor, but you can find 3 faculty members from different departments who will sponsor you, you can create your own unique doctoral program. So that's how I happened to receive a unique diploma in parapsychology.
Amazing. And amazing story. Yeah. Are you currently in an intimate relationship?
I've been married for 44 years.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Well, that's lovely. And do you have any children?
I have a stepson who currently lives with us. I don't have any children of my own.
How old is your stepson?
He's 53.
And has he followed in your footsteps?
No, he has his own interests, and my wife has her own interests, but they're both very supportive. And I couldn't have accomplished the things in life that I've done without a supportive family, because being a parapsychologist is a very, very difficult career. Most people, young people who ask about having a career in parapsychology are given the advice to first get a conventional degree, and then if you go into academia, get tenure, and only after you have full tenure should you explore parapsychology.
In other words, when you are safe and sound, right?
Yeah, I did the opposite, and I have no regrets.
Can you tell me about the 3 most influential people in your life that they have impacted you?
Oh, what a wonderful question.
Thank you.
Well, it goes back to my period as a college student. Shortly after I created my degree in parapsychology, I met a man named Arthur M. Young, who was giving talks and seminars at Berkeley He was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, the first
Ooh.
commercially licensed helicopter, and he became a cosmologist. He said in order to prove that he was worthy of exploring philosophy, he had to do something practical first. So even though his original interest was cosmology and philosophy, he went to the patent office in Washington, D.C. to find what are some of the unsolved problems of science and technology. And he learned that there had been 200 efforts, all unsuccessful, to develop a machine that could hover in midair.
Mm-hmm.
So he set out to do that, and he did it. And then he felt, now I'm worthy of being a philosopher. And he founded an organization called the Institute for the Study of Consciousness, and he set up a foundation in Berkeley. He bought a house there, and he invited me to live there with him while I was a college student. And so he was very influential in my life.
Anybody else?
Well, at the same time, of course, I met other people. My roommate at that institute was a fellow named Saul Paul Sirag, who was, at the time, he was a science journalist. He wrote a column called The New Alchemy that appeared in college newspapers around the country. And he moved in together, and Arthur Young provoked him to explore physics and the physics of consciousness more deeply. And he began developing his own unique theories about consciousness in hyperspace. In fact, I published his paper on a hyperspace view of consciousness in one of my first books. And so he was very influential in my career, and we are still close friends.
Mm. Well, speaking of well-known scientists, you also interviewed Stuart Hameroff.
Yes.
What did you think of his theory of the microtubules and being sort of the place where consciousness originates and resides?
Yeah, I think resides is probably
Okay.
the better word than originate. But
yeah.
the and I wrote about Hameroff in my essay for the Bigelow competition. Yes. I can't say that I'm qualified to evaluate his theory. It's very technical, involves neuroscience. I do think it's probably the most sophisticated theory that we have at this point, and it is testable. It's being tested. I haven't heard the results because I suspect they've come out with ambiguous results. I don't think they have a clear-cut test at this point. But I do know that he is very open to the possibility of survival after death in terms of his theory, that he talks about it in terms of what he called a quantum soul, that there could be quantum coherence that takes place in the brain, as you point out, in the microtubules, which are tiny little structures inside of the neurons. They typically or conventionally are thought to provide sort of a skeletal structure for the neurons themselves. But he believes that at the quantum level, consciousness, that's where consciousness resides, and that the electronic processing of the synapses, the electrical spikes that go down the axons and to the synapses and so on, that's not consciousness, that's information that resides on top of the level of consciousness in the brain. And he says, well, when the brain dies, the quantum coherence that exists could continue in what he called the quantum space or the quantum geometry. It could exist independent of the brain itself and possibly transfer to another brain, as in reincarnation.
Okay, so shifting a little bit from that, can you tell me about a peak experience in your life when you felt really, really happy?
Oh, gosh. The truth is, ever since I married my wonderful wife, Janelle, 44 years ago, I have been on a continuous peak experience.
Oh, well, that's the best. That's the best response I've ever gotten. Okay. And you will definitely earn a big kiss and hug from your wife on that one.
She is the joy of my life. And I couldn't have pursued this unusual career without
Mhm,
her love and
mhm,
support.
mhm, mhm. What is the best advice that you ever received?
Well, after I got my doctoral degree,
Yes,
1980, I
yes.
went to visit Arthur Young, my mentor that I told you about. I was very proud. And he was also an astrologer.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly enough, he pulled out his ephemeris and he had done some very, very precise and detailed work on my astrology chart, uncanny, beyond belief. And it correlated with things in his own chart, which was quite interesting. So he looked at the ephemeris and he said to me, "How long have you been working on this doctoral degree?" And I told him, over 6 years, six and a half
Oh, right.
years.
That's a long
He
time.
looked at the ephemeris and then he said to me, "Well, it's going to take you another 6 years to undo all the damage that the university has done to you." And I didn't want to believe it.
No.
It turned out to be true. And I think, his advice prepared me for 6 very, very difficult years that I had to endure
Mm.
after getting my degree. Um, so I have to say, it was oddly enough, that was some of the best advice I ever got.
Prepared you for the difficulties
Yeah, it
ahead.
was difficult on many levels.
Yes,
It was
yes.
difficult because I was attacked immediately by skeptics who wanted to get the university to
Mm.
reverse the degree and take it away from me.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, I had to fight a libel suit. Uh, and it took me 6 years to fight that libel suit, in which I finally received a settlement. But also, and I think this was his point, I had been pretty much indoctrinated at that point in my life to kind of a mechanistic way of looking at the world.
Sure. Yes.
And, and it took me a good 6 years while I was fighting the libel
Mm.
suit to realize that the universe, as much as mechanics and a materialistic worldview are very important. You can't drive an automobile without an appreciation for the laws of cause and effect, but that's not the whole story. And it really took me a good 6 years to sort of undo that
Mm.
uh, indoctrination. It's
Yeah.
implicit. I don't think they teach courses in it, but
No,
you go through the university and you come out a materialist.
absolutely. No doubt about it. And a skeptic.
Yeah.
Skeptic. In your biography, you state that you do financial forecasting.
Well,
What does that entail?
now I no longer am doing it. You were
Oh,
reading an older
oh,
biography.
okay.
However, I went through a lengthy phase of
Yes.
doing it, and it started. It started when back around the year 1999 during the internet boom.
Yes.
And one of my closest friends, another influential person I haven't mentioned, H. Dean Brown, a physicist, was making a lot of money in the stock market. And he made a point of saying, "Jeffrey, I want to show you how I do it, because
Yeah.
you could do this too." And he showed me his method. But then I decided that it's not enough just to learn one person's method. I need to understand the larger principles of forecasting and other methods. So I got involved in the use of neural networks for forecasting stock and commodity prices. And it worked beautifully. I made a lot of money in those years. Uh, and the thing that got me into it was that in parapsychology, there had been experiments using neural networks to determine, it's very interesting, you could do an ESP test with a random event generator,
Yes.
and you cut the results in half. You take the first half and the last half of the sessions of different people, mix them up, and then ask the neural networks to match them up again. Find out who, because you're looking at the relationship between the responses of the individual and the accuracy of a random target against a quantum mechanical random target. And the neural networks were able to identify what we would call psychic signatures, that each person has a unique pattern to their psychic abilities. And the neural network could find that and match up the first part and the last part of these random, supposedly random sequences or guesses about which random number in a 4-choice experiment would come up next. So that really impressed me of the power of neural networks. And I began applying it to financial forecasting. And as I say, I made some money back in those years. Eventually, I realized it's not for me. It wasn't the best match for my personality. And I got more involved in what I'm doing now, which is, the media interviews and helping to awaken people to the vast potential of human consciousness.
Well, speaking of that, how has all this work affected you as a person? How has it changed you?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. Other people might see it more than I do, but I'm certainly not the young person who grew up in a small town in the Midwest expecting to probably run a furniture store,
right,
or go into real estate or some other conventional business the way my other relatives have done. So
how do you feel about death and dying?
I think I'm at a point now where I have no fear of death whatsoever. The way that people who have had near-death experiences describe it, they lose all fear of death. And I've never had a near-death experience, but I've had so much exposure to people in the psychic and mystical world. I guess it's fair to say that I'm doing what I love, and I love the experiences that I have. I love talking with people like you, and my sense is that when we die, such as my dear friend Dean Brown, the one who introduced me to financial forecasting, he died almost 20 years ago. And I never felt sad when he died, even though he was probably my best friend at the time. I always felt like I know I'm going to see him again. And that we'll just continue our conversations where we left off.
How do you imagine that happening? I mean, we have 9 billion people right now living on this earth, and billions and billions and billions of people have preceded us. Yeah. What are the chances of meeting someone that you know in this cloud of billions and billions of souls, for example?
Well, ultimately, I think that love is a very important factor.
Yes.
In the universe. I kind of think that this universe was created for the very purpose of teaching us about love. And when I say us, that's a funny word, because all the mystics would tell you that we are all one. That's the basis of mysticism everywhere in the world, that the sense of separateness is an illusion. And from my studies of consciousness, and particularly the reports coming from spiritualist mediums and mystics around the world, that we will find each other through the bonds of love.
Well, that's kind of reassuring. That's reassuring. Yes. Yes. Well, thank you, You have certainly given me and hopefully our listeners a lot to think about. And it must be really, well, it must have been really difficult to get into this area. But I think that, you have done incredibly well. And I'm sure that you're happy now with the acceptance that you have received from the scientific community, probably not, from neuroscientists, but who cares?
I think I've had one of the best lives of all the many lifetimes I probably lived. This has been a very close, probably is the best one.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. May I call you Jeffrey? Yeah.
Of course,
Thank you. It's been absolutely delightful. And
likewise for me too.
thank you, and hope we can meet again sometime.
I would love it. And I also would like to encourage your listeners to check out the interviews on New Thinking Aloud that we have done with you. I think they're amongst the best.
Well, thank you, and I have enjoyed many of your interviews beside my own. And I just want to say to our listeners that my guest next week will be uh, kind of related to the subject that we have been discussing today. My guest next week will be Dr. Martha Atkins, author of Signposts of Dying, What You Need to Know. Dr. Atkins has worked with grieving and bereaved children and families at the end of life for the past 30 years. So I think that will be very, very interesting to listen to and to connect with what you have been saying to us, Jeffrey. And once again, thank you for being my guest. And like I said, I hope we can meet again.
My pleasure, Thomas.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.